Hi everyone, my name is Wyatt and this is my senior thesis for Integrative Studies 4350, Capstone Integrative Studies. My thesis is titled A Contemporary Study of Terrorism and Its Root Causes. The paper utilizes an interdisciplinary approach to perform an in-depth analysis of terrorism, and it explores possible remedies to a really critical problem that has become more and more common in recent years. Above all else, this paper aims to understand why terrorists, whether it be they individuals or terrorist networks, organizations, why they commit acts of terror and what their motivations are. The idea is that by better understanding what motivates terrorists and terrorist groups, we might be able to implement a more effective, a better process to combat terrorism. An interdisciplinary approach is absolutely necessary to my research because terrorism is an extremely complex problem, one that's constantly evolving, constantly changing. It's perhaps the most complicated problem that mankind faces today. Therefore, just one perspective would not be nearly adequate to even understand the problem that is terrorism, let alone to come up with an effective solution. So multiple disciplines were definitely needed in order to hopefully come up with a solution to such a complicated problem. I chose two disciplines for this thesis. They were history and political science. History aided my research tremendously because it provided a historical context surrounding terrorism, and it provides information as to what historically the motivations of terrorists have been versus what they are today. Political science, my second discipline, is relevant when examining the root causes of terrorism, because terrorism is, by definition, a political act. It's currently defined by the United States State Department as the use of violence or the threat of violence in order to achieve a political goal. Terrorist organizations themselves or the individuals in them may not be outwardly, overtly political. They may not advertise their political views, their aspirations publicly, but their goals 9 times out of 10 are political in nature. As a general rule, there's not a single root cause of terrorism, nothing that can be pointed to directly in every instance of terrorism. While it is true that some individuals are motivated by a singular event or life experience, or that an individual, their radicalization process may be catalyzed by one single event, it's most often a combination of several different factors that influence individuals and groups to commit acts of terror as a means to advance whatever their agenda may be. This paper, one of the aims of this paper is to put forth the idea that terrorism isn't the actual problem. Rather, radicalism is the true problem, with terrorism simply being a symptom of that problem. Subsequently, my research indicates, and this paper argues, that counter-terrorism should be replaced with counter-radicalism as the leading school of thought when it comes to global security. The research and the evidence likens terrorism to a house of cards, with radicalism being the bottommost row of cards. If that row of cards is removed, the entire house collapses. Put simply, terrorism can't stand on its own without radicalism. You can be a radical and not a terrorist, but you cannot be a terrorist without being a radical. A brief introduction to terrorism. Terrorism has been on the rise since 9/11, when Al-Qaeda flew planes into the Pentagon, the Twin Towers in New York, and they attempted to fly one into the White House. Since then, the United States has been involved in a global war on terror, and evidence has shown that terrorist attacks have increased almost 6 times since the fall of 2001, when 9/11 occurred. that being said, terrorism is not a modern innovation at all. Some of the earliest known terrorists were the Sicarii. They were Jewish zealots in the Middle East in the first century AD. Their aim was to overthrow Roman authorities in the Middle East at the time. Later, modern terrorism was ushered in with the French Reign of Terror during the French Revolution, during which Maximilien Robespierre personally ordered the beheading of nearly 20,000 people, French citizens. Further about terrorism, a common misconception is that terrorism is, as a rule, fueled by religious ideology, which is not true. While a majority of terrorists and terrorist organizations are based on religion, there are numerous groups, technically designated terrorist groups by the State Department, that are not religious in nature at all, including crime syndicates like the Italian Mafia, Cosa Nostra, and Mexican and South American drug cartels. They've all been named terrorist organizations in the past. And although these groups, for the most part, may all ascribe to the same religion, their actions don't come as a direct result of their religious ideology, so the network itself is not religious in nature. It's more so that the people are still religious. The aims of this paper are to answer these questions. Mainly, what causes terrorism, but also, are the root causes economic, social, or religious in nature? Are certain areas of the world more susceptible to terrorism, or are certain demographic groups more susceptible to terrorism, more likely to commit terrorism or be victimized by acts of terror? These are just a few questions that, if answered, could provide the knowledge needed to more effectively fight terrorism. Political science, one of the disciplines I chose, is necessary discipline to study when you're looking at terrorism, because terrorism is, as I said before, it's inherently political. Some groups cloak their agendas in religious fervor or religious ideology, but their goals nonetheless remain political in nature. For the purposes of this paper, various economic, social, and political issues have been sort of combined under the umbrella-like discipline of political science, if you will. And among political scientists, there have long been two leading schools of thought when it comes to what causes terrorism. Two camps. The first postulates that social and economic development go hand in hand with democratization and therefore terrorism. The claim is that there's an inverse relationship between the two. That is, with increased economic and social development comes increased democratization, and with increased democratization comes a less likely chance that terrorism will occur. So the more economic and socially developed the region is, the less likely it is that that region will be susceptible to terrorism, essentially. The second camp of political scientists, they theorize that terrorists are most often motivated by a combination of events, like a perfect storm of factors that causes people to turn to terrorism. My second discipline that I chose for this thesis is history, primarily because in order to understand a terrorist's motivations, you have to understand their culture, which is dictated by their histories. These groups have different histories, and as a result of these differing histories, they have different values, different morals, and different customs. Therefore, their motivations will more than likely be different as well. So it's not a cookie cutter scenario where a one size fits all solution. It varies case by case, depending on the group, depending on the region. Even within regions, group by group, it can be different. Terrorism has evolved over time, from the earliest known terrorists to terrorists during the French Revolution, to post-World War II nationalist movements, to contemporary terrorists like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, different groups have different motivations and objectives. And it's only by understanding these groups' motivations that we can identify the root causes and more effectively combat terrorism as an institution. After synthesizing all the knowledge I gained by studying history and political science for this paper, it's become clear that while there is no simple solution to the wicked problem that is terrorism, there is hope to better understand the phenomenon and what drives it, what causes terrorism to be committed on such a large scale, especially since 2001, where we've seen a six-fold increase in the frequency of terrorism. Although terrorism is consistently evolving, year by year, maybe even day by day, two things remain constant with terrorism regardless. There's going to be violence, and there will be an ultimate goal or an agenda. Knowing that terrorists have an end game in mind, a objective that they're trying to achieve, is actually good news for the civilized world. Knowing what they want, what terrorists want, is the first step to solving the problem. If we know what they want, we can better predict their actions and more effectively combat terrorism by whatever means necessary. If we don't have any idea, for example, if the Islamic State was running around the Middle East, murdering, enslaving, doing everything they're doing in the Middle East right now, they have been doing since 2011, and they didn't have a goal, their goal is a caliphate, a united Islamic nation in the Middle East. If we didn't know that they had a goal, if they were just running around doing this because they wanted to, it would be a much bigger problem, because you can't attempt to assuage something like that. If now that we know they have an end game in mind, we can kind of try to get out in front of it and rein them in to a certain degree just by denying them what they want. So in conclusion, biggest takeaways from my research and from this thesis is that there are tons of factors that influence terrorism, too many to count, too many to get there's no prescription for it. It's not the same for everybody. But most of the influencing factors are rooted in social, economic, or human rights deprivation. By providing radical extremists with a better alternative to committing acts of terror, maybe it's a critical step in combating radicalism, and therefore it's a critical step in stemming the rising tide of terrorism altogether. If we can, as a global community, if we can provide youths who are being radicalized to join the Islamic State, for example, if we can provide them with a better alternative than strapping on suicide vests and killing innocent civilians, then I'm sure they would take that opportunity and they would vastly prefer it over senseless violence for a reason that they most likely don't even understand. Thanks for your time, guys.